In 1970, AMC bought Jeep from Kaiser for about $75 million. And while today the Jeep brand is one of the most valuable automotive brands in history, that was quite a controversial move for little AMC at the time. You see, in order to procure Jeep, AMC had to take on quite a bit of debt, which it subsequently had to service at relatively high interest rates, and that caused the company to be relatively capital constrained all throughout the 1970s and even further on after that. And aside from that particular issue, Jeep really didn't take off until many years later when the SUV craze became very popular. More specifically, after AMC had sold to Chrysler in the late 1980s, the SUV boom really started then and continued for many, many years up until this day. One of the great things that Jeep did for AMC was give it some technology that it could leverage for cars. And we all know that AMC had the Hornet, which later evolved into the Concorde in 1978. And the Concorde spawned another vehicle in 1980 that would employ some of that Jeep technology, and that is, of course, the Eagle. When introduced, the Eagle was quite revolutionary as there really were no other domestic passenger vehicles that had four-wheel drive. This was, again, the era before crossovers became popular. And so having a four-wheel drive car, whether that was a coupe, a sedan, or a wagon, or a fastback in Eagle form, you could pick whatever Eagle you wanted. They all had four-wheel drive. This was a novel concept for a domestic auto company. Now, while the Eagle itself was pretty popular, there was an interesting variant of the Eagle that was introduced and actually sold through AMC dealers, and that was the AMC Eagle Sundancer. Now, remember, during the early 1980s and just a few years prior to that, it was thought that convertibles were no longer going to be available to be sold to the buying public. Hence, Cadillac Eldorado, as an example, in 1976, was billed as the last convertible for Cadillac before it was going to be introduced again in the early 1980s. And that's because the federal government imposed or was threatening to impose rollover standards on all vehicles. And as a result, a car like a convertible just wasn't going to be able to meet that. And so by the early 1980s, there were a number of aftermarket conversion shops that were making convertibles to fulfill a demand from the buying public that the automakers just couldn't do by themselves. And for the 1981 and 1982 model years on AMC Eagles and Concordes, there was this particular model, the Sundancer. Now, as mentioned, the Sundancer was sold through AMC dealers, but it was not a factory-produced vehicle. What you'd have to do if you wanted a Sundancer, you'd order it from the dealer and you'd pay a 40% markup in order to get one of these. In fact, almost $4,000 on top of a standard AMC Concorde or Eagle's base cost. And then the car would be shipped to Florida, where Jack Griffith and his team would convert the car into the Sundancer. Now, why Jack Griffith? Well, Jack Griffith had, prior to the AMC Sundancer, created a convertible version of the Toyota Celica called the Sun Chaser. And so when, for whatever reason, Jack Griffith approached AMC with this idea, he decided to label it similarly, the Sundancer. And of course, AMC management, looking to have a little bit of excitement in the showrooms beyond the standard lineup, I think thought that this was an easy way to get some excitement and bring people into the showrooms. Interesting thing about the Sundancer, though, is that it's not really a full-fledged convertible. It's more like a Targa top in a number of ways with this big chunky B-pillar. And then you have this kind of mini soft top that closes up the back between the trunk and that big B-pillar that you can see here. So you got the Targa roof portion, and then you have this little, I guess I'll call it convertible top with the rear window in the back. I actually think for an aftermarket conversion that this car doesn't look that bad. It actually looks pretty good and kind of cool. Now, one thing to remember about these Eagles in terms of how they started life was that they were unibody cars. And you can imagine that chopping off the roof as well as the back portion of the car was something that proved challenging from a structural rigidity standpoint. It's part of the reason why that chunky B-pillar still exists, is to provide some structure. But Griffith also had to add a full perimeter frame to these cars underneath to ensure that they had enough structural rigidity so that they wouldn't bend in half as they were driving down the road. Now, another interesting thing about the Sundancer was that they all started life as an Eagle Limited, which was the top of the line trim. You couldn't get a Sundancer that had anything other than the Eagle Limited trim with the nutmeg interior. There was only one interior in leather during that time frame for AMC. And of course, being smart, AMC picked a neutral color that went with everything, hence the nutmeg coloring that you see here. And a beautiful nutmeggy color it is indeed. Notice that this vehicle is fully loaded. It has power windows, power locks, power seat, the optional 3-spoke sports steering wheel, air conditioning, and a whole host of other options. But these AMC Eagle Limited interiors really were quite comfortable. Notice the loose cushion style design there that was popular in many of the cars. I would say actually even before this, AMC was a bit late to the game with the loose cushion style. And one thing that was relatively rare for the time period is that the Eagles and AMC cars had the reclining seat backs. You can see the lever there for the seat back recliner. And for whatever reason, domestic car companies were so late to adopt that. Now, this is also a relatively early Eagle. This doesn't have the full-time four-wheel drive setup, but if you look to the left of the steering wheel, you'll see a little switch that you can flip, and you basically have to ensure the car is stopped. This is not shift on the fly at this point. It would later become shift on the fly. But you have to stop the car, and AMC purposely made it a two-hand switch over to four-wheel drive. You have to pull a little knob with one hand and then move the slider bar over with the other. There's no way to do it with just one hand, and that means that you got to stop the vehicle in order to execute it. Kind of a smart design on the part of AMC, and it precluded people from doing this on the fly. Now, one humorous thing about the AMC four-wheel drive setup in these cars, and what was a very, very good setup, you could leave it in four-wheel drive all the time. It wasn't just a part-time setup, so you could put it on dry pavement in four-wheel drive, have no worry about driving around, taking corners, and really stressing the four-wheel drive setup because of a viscous coupling between the front and the rear wheels within the transfer case that allowed them to spin at different rates. And once they were spinning at different rates, that fluid would become more viscous and then transfer more power to the wheels that didn't have traction. Really just a genius setup, particularly for the 1980s. And again, one that I would say in some ways is even better than four-wheel drive setups that are out there on many vehicles today that are completely part-time. You'll notice on many four-wheel drive vehicles today there's an auto setting. That auto setting just engages the part-time four-wheel drive when it detects wheel spin and then disengages it otherwise. But here you could have it in true full-time four-wheel drive and not worry. Now, this particular Eagle also has this deluxe cassette player that you can see here, relatively rare for the time period. Cassette players were just becoming popular, and obviously has air conditioning. On these cars, there are no vacuum-operated servos on the HVAC. That's all cable-operated. So as you move that slider bar from max AC to AC to heat to high-low, again, it's just all done with cables. Ingenious that AMC was able to do this, whereas other automakers like Chevrolet used to have a 3-cable setup, or AMC even had a 4-cable setup in earlier years. They had basically consolidated it to this setup and had it mimic a setup that was much more expensive. Gotta love AMC doing so much with so little. This car also has the rear speaker fader, which is that radial control knob there at the bottom. Now, under hood in these Eagles came AMC's venerable 258 cubic inch, 4.2 liter inline 6-cylinder engine with a Carter 2-barrel carburetor. It was a relatively reliable setup. It didn't make much horsepower, around 110-ish horsepower at the time, but it did have good torque. I have a 1982 AMC Eagle, and it gets off the line just fine, but if you floor it from about 50 miles an hour up, you really just got to wait for it to gain speed. In any case, it was a reliable setup, and I would say aside from one flaw, and that was that these came standard with a Creighton valve cover. Creighton was a division of AMC that made plastics, and they made the fender flares for the Eagle, and they also made the valve covers. Now, this particular car has had an aftermarket conversion and has a different valve cover on it because, unfortunately, what happens to plastic over numerous thermal cycles? It leaks. And so those Creighton valve covers were known as significant leakers. In any case, despite the venerable engine under hood and the cool styling, you can see the target top removed here and the convertible top down. I guess I'll call it a convertible top. Don't know what to call that little soft top portion. The Sundancer was not very successful, and only about a couple hundred were made. And so Griffith was not able to continue on with producing such convertibles. I think he had originally envisioned a conversion shop in Wisconsin. Nothing really came of that, and he was not able to produce a subsequent Sun Chaser variant of the next generation Toyota Celica. So this really created some financial hardship for Jack Griffith and his company. But the cars are pretty cool, and today they're quite valuable. In fact, the copy that I'm showing you here is one that sold for almost $40,000. Yes, I said that right, almost $40,000 on Bring a Trailer a few years ago. I would never have thought that an Eagle or a variant of an Eagle could bring that kind of coin, but it certainly did. And I think, well, I guess all I can say is it's certainly a unique collectible. And of course, being the bean counter that I am, I have tremendous respect for AMC and what they did with so little. This Eagle was effectively just a 1970 Hornet platform that had been warmed over once when it was turned into the Concorde, and then warmed over again when it was turned into the Eagle. And AMC had so many little tricks that they came up with. They used the same front fender for a number of years, and that little chrome trim above the headlamp there, that is part of the headlamp bezel, and it disguises the fact that the fender is the same between a number of these variants. They got a whole new front end, and they basically just covered up the sheet metal underneath it and gave the front end a new look with that egg crate grille texture too on the Eagle. AMC, again, just genius in terms of how much they did with so little. Their next step was really doing everything with nothing. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the AMC Eagle Sundancer. Let me know what you thought. Put a comment in the comment section, and please subscribe. It's free. You don't have to pay anything. Push that little button, circular button in the center here of the 67 Riviera. Thanks again for watching.